January 28, 1945. Southern Poland. The sky is a dull sheet of winter iron. Snow lies in hard ridges along the frozen road, broken only by the boot prints of children who have walked farther than their strength should allow. Their faces are pale, hollow, framed by scarves and coats too large for their small bodies. Some hold hands, some walk alone. All of them move in silence. Behind them, the barbed wire perimeter of a Nazi camp sits half-collapsed, abandoned by guards who fled only hours earlier as Soviet armor pushed west. The wooden watchtowers stand empty. The gates hang open. For the first time in years, these children step beyond them, not through planned rescue, not through organized transport, but simply because no one is left to stop them. The world around them is cold, unfamiliar, and vast. Each step they take is a step without certainty. No map, no family waiting beyond the horizon. Only survival, instinct, and the memory of everything they have seen. Their escape is not a moment of triumph. It is the beginning of a long, uncertain journey, one that will shape the rest of their lives. The final winter of the war brought confusion, collapse, and movement on a scale Europe had not witnessed in generations. By late 1944, the German front was disintegrating under pressure from both east and west. As Soviet forces advanced through Poland, many Nazi officials ordered the evacuation of concentration camps. Others fled without organized withdrawal, abandoning prisoners in conditions that defied comprehension. Among these were thousands of children, Jewish, Roma, Polish, Soviet, and others, taken from homes, villages, and ghettos across occupied Europe. Some had been transported to large extermination complexes such as Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek. Others were held in smaller labor camps where disease and starvation had hollowed out entire populations. The camp system was vast, defined by forced labor, transport convoys, and a bureaucracy designed to erase identities. By the start of 1945, frontline battles were reaching the perimeter of these sites. The German priority shifted from maintaining control to slowing the advance through chaotic withdrawals. Guards abandoned posts. Communication lines broke down. Transport orders were issued and rescinded within hours. Entire columns of prisoners were forced into death marches. Others, especially children deemed too weak to move, were simply left behind. In this collapse, rare moments of escape became possible. Some children walked out unnoticed. Others were found by advancing Allied soldiers. A few were taken in by local civilians who risked their lives to hide them. Each child's fate depended on geography, timing, and chance. But to understand where these children eventually went, to understand what it meant to rebuild a life after such darkness, we must first examine the world surrounding these escapes and how history shaped every choice that followed. As liberation spread across Eastern Europe in early 1945, the situation for surviving children was far from resolved. Walking out of a camp did not mean safety. Most were severely malnourished. Many were sick with typhus, tuberculosis, or infections untreated for months. Some could barely speak after years of isolation. Others had no memory of their original names, only numbers, fragments, or nicknames given by fellow prisoners. Allied forces encountered them in scattered groups along roads, in abandoned barracks, or hidden inside nearby forests. Soviet units moving westward found children wrapped in blankets beside makeshift fires. American troops reaching camps like Buchenwald and Dachau documented scenes of young survivors wandering the grounds, searching for familiar faces. British forces entering Bergen-Belsen found hundreds of children lying among the sick, exhausted by starvation and disease. Humanitarian networks quickly mobilized. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the Red Cross, and Jewish aid groups began establishing children's centers in Warsaw, Prague, Munich, and other recovering cities. These centers became temporary worlds of rebuilding, medical rooms, classrooms, and dormitories filled with children who had once been separated by wire and guards. Yet the greatest challenge of all was identity. Allies collected testimonies, compared transport lists, and placed notices in newspapers across Europe, hoping parents might still be alive to claim their children. In many cases, they were not. Entire families had been destroyed. Home villages no longer existed. Borders were shifting, governments collapsing, and new conflicts erupting. For the children who escaped or survived, life after liberation became a new battle. One fought not with weapons, but with paperwork, memory, and the struggle to understand who they were. For many child survivors, escape from a camp did not restore childhood. It only exposed how much of it had been taken. Psychologists working with UNRRA in 1945 noted that some children avoided touch, flinching at raised voices or sudden movements. Others hoarded bread under mattresses, unable to believe food would return the next day. Night terrors were common. Grief surfaced in unexpected ways. A quiet refusal to speak, an intense attachment to a single caregiver, or a fixation on routines that brought a sense of control. In children's centers across Europe, caregivers discovered that even play carried the imprint of trauma. Some children built imaginary camps out of blocks. Others created games mimicking roll calls or hiding from guards. The challenge was not only to teach reading or arithmetic. It was to rebuild the feeling of safety, something they had not known for years. This emotional reconstruction would shape the adults they later became, influencing careers in medicine, activism, law, education, and social work. Reestablishing identity was one of the defining struggles. Camp records were often destroyed by retreating German units. Transport documents were incomplete. Many children arrived at aid centers without names, birthdays, or nationalities. Efforts to reconstruct identities involved comparing tattoo numbers, survivor testimonies, and transport logs recovered from abandoned offices. In some cases, identity hinged on a single memory, a street name, a lullaby, or a relative's nickname. Aid workers traveled between towns searching for surviving relatives. Jewish organizations placed photographs of children in newspapers worldwide, hoping someone recognized a face. For thousands, no one did. These children were classified as unaccompanied minors, a category that would determine their futures: adoption, immigration, or transfer to long-term care. Their paperwork became the bridge between war and the life that followed. Not all escapes were moments of liberation by Allied soldiers. In the final months of the war, confusion inside collapsing German command structures created narrow opportunities. Guards fled ahead of Soviet advances. Perimeter fences were left unwatched. Some children slipped through holes cut by prisoners who had planned escapes for months. Others followed fleeing groups of adults who understood the terrain better. In camps closer to the front, artillery fire created chaos, forcing guards to retreat to fortified positions, leaving barracks unmonitored. Local civilians played unpredictable roles. Some offered shelter in barns or attics. Others, fearing German reprisals or accusations of collaboration, turned children away. A few children followed railway tracks, hoping they would lead toward cities. Others walked toward the sound of distant shell fire, believing the advancing armies represented safety. These improvised escapes were influenced by geography, timing, and the sheer will to keep moving. For soldiers and civilians who encountered these young survivors, the moment carried moral weight. Reports from Soviet units describe soldiers giving up rations so children could eat. British medical teams arriving at Bergen-Belsen documented the emotional burden of caring for children who were skeletal, sick, and unable to comprehend the concept of rescue. Many relief workers were young themselves, nurses in their early 20s, volunteers fresh from university, officers seeing the effects of systematic starvation for the first time. Their actions would shape the next stages of the children's lives. The decision to hold a child's hand, to write down their name carefully, to search for surviving relatives, these choices created pathways to rehabilitation. In a world shattered by conflict, the compassion of these individuals helped rebuild identities and futures. The children's journeys would soon reach their most defining moments. The turning point for many of these children came not in the moment they left the camps, but in the first structured environment where someone finally took responsibility for their future. One of the earliest and most documented examples occurred in April 1945 at Buchenwald. When American forces entered the camp, they found more than 900 children among the survivors, a number far larger than in most other liberated sites. These children were gathered in Block 66, a barracks intentionally hidden by political prisoners who had spent months shielding them from forced labor and executions. The moment of discovery was later described by soldiers as both shocking and defining. S-troops moved through the barracks, many too weak to walk. Medical teams arrived with stretchers, food, and blankets. For the first time, the children were addressed not as prisoners, but as individuals, each with a name recorded, a condition noted, a photograph taken. Similar scenes unfolded across Europe. At Auschwitz, Soviet doctors documented the condition of the surviving children and separated the sickest for immediate treatment. In Bergen-Belsen, British medical teams converted nearby military facilities into emergency hospitals, prioritizing children who had survived the starvation and disease that claimed thousands even after liberation. But the true climax came weeks later, when decisions had to be made. Aid organizations gathered lists of orphans. Immigration offices contacted foreign governments. In some cases, small groups of children were selected for transport to new homes. Jewish orphans from Buchenwald were among those sent to France, Switzerland, and eventually Palestine. Polish and Czech children were repatriated through national committees. Some were reunited with surviving parents against all odds. It was in this period, between discovery and placement, that their futures became defined. From this point forward, the question of where they would go and who they would become could no longer be delayed. As Europe emerged from the final battles of 1945, the decisive turning point for these children shifted from military liberation to long-term resettlement. The question was no longer who survived, but where they would belong. Nations already scarred by devastation faced another monumental challenge: caring for thousands of displaced minors whose families, homes, and countries had been erased by war. In cities like Prague, Warsaw, and Munich, international committees began reviewing individual cases. Each child's file contained only fragments: notes from liberating soldiers, medical assessments, partial lists rescued from abandoned offices. Decisions carried immense weight. A misplaced name could separate a child from surviving relatives. An incorrect nationality could send them to a country they had never known. Some children were placed on transport lists bound for the United Kingdom under special programs created in 1945. Others were sent to Sweden and Switzerland, where civilian families volunteered to host them during recovery. Zionist youth movements organized convoys toward British-controlled Palestine, believing that Jewish children needed a homeland where their identity would no longer be criminalized. In France, the OSE, Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, established rehabilitation homes designed to rebuild education, nutrition, and emotional stability before the children entered wider society. These choices became the defining crossroads of their lives. A child sent to London grew up speaking English, entering British schools. A child placed in a kibbutz in Palestine became part of the generation that later witnessed the foundation of Israel. A child who remained in Eastern Europe lived through the rise of post-war communist regimes, experiencing an entirely different political world. This period, 1945 to 1948, became the moment when the trajectories of young survivors spread in every direction across the globe. From this divergence came the answer to the question that echoes through history: where did the children who escaped the camps eventually go? In the immediate aftermath of resettlement, the children entered societies still struggling to rebuild themselves. Their new environments offered safety, but not always understanding. Many adults could not imagine what these young survivors had endured. Teachers noted that some children resisted authority, reacting to discipline as if it were a return to camp conditions. Others remained withdrawn, speaking only when necessary, observing classmates with a caution shaped by years of survival. Medical assessments from the late 1940s recorded long-term effects of starvation and disease, delayed growth, chronic infections, impaired vision. Psychological support barely existed. Trauma was rarely discussed, and in some countries, the pressure to move on became the unspoken expectation. Yet the resilience of these children became one of the most documented phenomena of post-war recovery. Many learned new languages within months. Some excelled academically, driven by an urgent need to rebuild control over their lives. Others gravitated towards skilled trades, relying on practical abilities learned in labor camps or during flight. Community organizations played a critical role. Jewish relief groups created cultural and religious spaces where identity could be rebuilt without fear. Social workers in Britain and France emphasized routine, meals at fixed hours, regular schooling, structured recreation, helping children regain a sense of safety. In Palestine, youth villages became foundations for a new generation shaped by survival and renewed purpose. But even with support, the past was never far away. Their memories shaped their futures in ways the world was only beginning to understand. By the 1950s, the surviving children had reached adolescence or adulthood. Their lives were unfolding across continents, yet they were bound by a shared history that shaped every decision they made. Many eventually learned the full extent of what had happened to their families only after accessing post-war records or speaking with other survivors. For others, it unfolded gradually through testimonies collected during war crimes investigations. A significant number emigrated to the United States, Canada, Australia, and South America under post-war immigration programs. They arrived speaking several languages, carrying few belongings, determined to build new identities. Survivor testimonies recorded in later decades reveal common paths: careers in medicine, law, teaching, engineering, social work, psychology. Some became advocates for human rights, using their experiences to influence public understanding of persecution and genocide. Others chose quiet lives, raising families while keeping the past largely private. As they aged, many began sharing their stories publicly. In the 1980s and 1990s, historical institutions and memorial centers launched large-scale oral history projects, giving these now-grown children a platform to speak with clarity and dignity. Their voices reshaped global memory of the Holocaust and other wartime atrocities. They emphasized not only what they had survived, but also what they had rebuilt: communities, families, careers, and futures once thought impossible. Their journeys, once uncertain roads through snow and ruins, had become stories that helped the world understand the cost of hatred and the strength of human endurance. The story of the children who escaped the camps is not only a narrative of survival, it is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit under unimaginable conditions. They emerged from darkness into a world that was itself fractured, carrying memories of loss, fear, and isolation. And yet, through the care of compassionate strangers, the structure of humanitarian networks, and their own extraordinary resilience, they began to rebuild lives that were once thought impossible. Their experiences highlight the fragile intersection of chance, courage, and circumstance. A gap in a fence, the presence of a kind soldier, the willingness of a volunteer. Any of these small acts could determine life or death. But beyond survival, these children confronted the deeper challenge of reclaiming identity. Relearning names, languages, and customs became acts of resistance against the erasure imposed by the camps. Each story of adaptation, achievement, and advocacy reminds us that even the youngest victims of atrocity carry the power to shape history. Today, their lives span continents and professions. Some have shared their testimonies publicly, others quietly pass lessons to their families. But all carry a history that underscores the cost of prejudice and the value of compassion. Their journey from barbed wire to adulthood remains a profound reminder. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, survival can give rise to hope, courage, and the enduring potential to transform the world. The memory of these children continues to teach generations about resilience, responsibility, and humanity itself.